August 19, 1942, deep within the jungles close to Tivu Point on Guadalcanal 2, Lieutenant Gennaro Emmy of the 8th Impartial Anti-Tank Gun Enterprise made a diary access that could seize the shock and disillusionment felt by many Japanese infantrymen upon their first encounters with American forces. Hid below the dense canopy of palm trees and tenacious vines, MI, alongside 916 different infantrymen of Colonel Kono, Ikiki's detachment had disembarked from destroyers, finishing a midnight insertion that Japanese command believed would be the initial decisive step towards reclaiming Henderson Field. They had been brought about trust that the individuals numbered handiest round 2,000 poorly trained, without difficulty intimidated, and softened with the aid of lives of ease. Colonel Ikiki himself had disregarded warnings to look forward to reinforcements, expectantly affirming to his officials, "These are Americans. We can sweep them into the ocean before sunrise." Unbeknownst to those battle-hardened veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, they were on the verge of experiencing something absolutely unheard of within the annals of the Imperial Eastern military. It wasn't simply the opportunity of defeat, a nearly unthinkable concept for infantrymen who had recognized not anything however victory on account that 1937, but a systematic unraveling of each tactical assumption, every strategic precept, every ideological truth that described the Japanese manner of battle. The jungle itself might come to be a weapon wielded by means of the individuals. The darkness which had been the Japanese force's ally, given that the beginning of the war could now betray them, and the overwhelming American superiority in gadget coordination and sheer damaging electricity, would shatter the cautiously cultivated fantasy of Japanese invincibility in near fight. This alteration had began weeks prior on August 7th, whilst 11,000 American Marines of the Primary Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Factor under the command of well-known Alexander Vandergrift. Those leathernecks were executing Operation Watchtower, the primary American offensive operation of the Pacific Battle. Their objective on paper, regarded fairly trustworthy: seize the nearly completed eastern airfield, set up a defensive perimeter, and preserve the position till relieved. In reality, they had been about to engage in what might emerge as the longest and most brutal marketing campaign in Marine Corps history, up to that factor in an environment that could take a look at human staying power to its absolute limits. The island itself turned into a vision immediately out of a tropical nightmare. Guadalcanal stretched 90 mi in period and 25 mi in width. Its indoors ruled through implementing mountains that soared to 8,000 toes, their peaks continuously shrouded in clouds. The slender coastal plain wherein Henderson area was located changed into a suffocating strip of kunai grass swamp and dense jungle, so thick that visibility changed into often decreased to mere ft. The heat was oppressive, with humidity levels not often dipping underneath 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in such dense clouds that men inadvertently inhaled them. The rivers and streams, which appeared clean and welcoming in reconnaissance pics, teemed with parasites and disorder. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would ultimately incapacitate more men than enemy motion. But on that first morning, the Marines located the airfield sincerely undefended. The 200 Jap creation workers and 600 naval troops had fled into the jungle, leaving behind their gadget resources, and maximum significantly, the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers have been already tough at work finishing the runway. They might christen it Henderson Discipline in honor of foremost Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who have been killed at halfway. Inside days, the primary aircraft would land and the island would become the bottom of operations for what history could consider because the Cactus air pressure. The Japanese reaction turned into speedy and catastrophic for American naval forces. At the nighttime of August 9th, Vice Admiral Ganishi Mikawa led a force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer via the darkness in a superb wonder attack. The following War of Savo Island have become the worst naval defeat in USA Navy history. 4 heavy cruisers, the USA Quincy, USA Vincent, U.S. Historia, and the HMS Canra were dispatched to the bottom in much less than an hour. Greater than 1,000 sailors perished in the flaming waters. The surviving Allied naval forces withdrew, taking with them most of the people of the materials that had not yet been unloaded. The Marines had been now stranded, reduced off, and facing a strengthened enemy with barely half their equipment and food. What the Japanese excessive command did not completely understand in the one's early days of August changed into that Henderson's subject had emerged as the linchpin to the whole campaign. Manage of the airfield meant control of the surrounding seas at some point of daylight hours. Aircraft working from Henderson could strike any Jap ship inside a 200-mile radius. This unmarried, inescapable reality would dictate the entire nature of the marketing campaign. The Japanese should personal the night, sending in troops and substances aboard fast destroyers in runs that have become infamously called the Tokyo Pacific. However, whilst dawn broke, American plane dominated the skies. The strategic vital demanded that Japan retake Henderson's subject right away before the Americans could in addition beef up their role. Imperial Trendy Headquarters assigned this vital venture to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayakudake, 17th Army based at Rabel. Hayakudake had best constrained forces simply available. The 35th Infantry Brigade below Fundamental Preferred Kiyotake Kawaguchi changed into stationed at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment changed into inside the Philippines. The nearest unit changed into Colonel Ikaki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which were stationed near Guam, originally meant for the halfway operation that have been cancelled after the disastrous naval defeat in June. Colonel Kona Ikaki was a trainer on the infantry faculty, with a reputation as an extraordinarily capable tactician. He became additionally regarded for his impulsiveness and his unwavering notion in the prevalence of Eastern fighting spirit over American cloth. Before his troops departed for Guadalcanal, Ikaki acquired express orders to watch for the rest of his regiment earlier than attempting to retake the airfield. However, Ikaki held little or no appreciate for American infantrymen. He had studied reports from China, from the Philippines, and from each different theater where Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. He concluded that they lacked area broke effortlessly beneath stress and couldn't likely healthy Jap warriors in near fight. At the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers introduced 917 guys of Ikaki's 1st Detachment to Tivu Point, located 15 mi east of the Yankee perimeter. The touchdown proceeded smoothly undetected by American forces. Ikaki straightaway dispatched reconnaissance patrols to evaluate enemy strength and protecting positions. It was an ordinary tactical choice that might show to be deadly. On August 19th, a patrol from Agency, a primary battalion 1st Marines under the command of Captain Charles Brush, become shifting along the coastal dune towards Kohai Factor after they encountered Jap squaddies. The two forces clashed in a brief, however excessive firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese infantrymen and captured files that revealed the presence of a good-sized enemy force inside the region. Greater importantly, the captured papers indicated that the Japanese severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced returned to the fringe, along with his important intelligence. Popular Vandergrift right away understood the results, a Japanese assault become impending, maximum probably from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to bolster the defenses alongside the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines mistakenly called the Tenaru River. It turned into honestly the Ilu River, however the misnomer would persist in all next money owed. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank, with system guns cautiously placed to create interlocking fields of fire throughout the sandbar. What followed would end up one of the maximum lopsided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ikaki, instead of waiting for intelligence from his misplaced patrol or for reinforcements, decided to release an immediate attack. At the nighttime of August 20th, Continuing into the early morning of August 21st, he ordered a frontal attack directly across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized the overpowering strength of non-secular strength and aggressive night assaults to triumph over enemy firepower. Ikuki firmly believed that his veterans should damage through American defenses through sheer audacity and near quarters fighting where Jap soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades. Simply after middle of the night, Solomon Islander Jacob Vuza, who had escaped from Eastern captivity after enduring hours of torture, stumbled into the Marine lines with a critical warning the Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the attack began. Hundreds of Jap squaddies charged across the sandbar, screaming struggle cries, firing rifles and hurling grenades. They ran directly into a meticulously organized killing area that the Marines had established with methodical precision. The M19117A1 Browning water-cooled device guns opened fireplace. Those guns, perfected all through world battle-eye, had been the unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each gun could sustain a price of 600 rounds according to minute indefinitely, as long as the water jacket remained filled. The Marines had positioned them in together assisting positions, making sure that no place of the sandbar remained exposed. Eastern infantrymen fell in waves because the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore via flesh and bone. People who controlled to make it throughout the sandbar encountered 37 mm anti-tank weapons loaded with canister rounds, essentially large shotgun shells that became men into shredded meat. The attack persisted for hours. Wave after wave of Eastern infantrymen charged into the unrelenting machine gun hearth. A few reached the Marine positions and engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, knives, fists, and anything else they might lay their arms on. But the defensive preparations held firm. The interlocking fields of hearth avoided any Japanese leap forward. As sunrise approached, Colonel Ikuki's attack had absolutely stalled. Extra than 800 of his men lay lifeless or demise at the sandbar and in the shallow water. Daybreak introduced no respite for the surviving Jap. Fashionable Vandergrift ordered a counterattack using elements of the 1st Battalion 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and started systematically searching down Eastern infantrymen who had taken cover in the coconut groves. Warfare correspondent Richard Trigascus, looking from a Marine role, defined the scene. It turned into fascinating to see them bustling amongst the bushes, pivoting, turning spitting sheets of yellow flame. We had now not found out there were so many Eastern in the grove. Group after group had been flushed out and shot down through the tank's canister shells. By means of midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru turned into over. Of the 917 Jap squaddies who had landed at Tivu Factor, about 800 had been lifeless. About 128 survivors, in the main from support units that had remained near the touchdown website, melted back into the jungle. They might ship a radio message to the 17th Navy headquarters reporting the devastating loss. A few of the lifeless was Colonel Ikuki himself, despite the fact that money owed range as to the correct situations of his death. The professional Eastern version claimed that he burned his regimental colorings and devoted ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted that he died, paying a final desperate price. Marine casualties were approximately 40 killed and wounded. The psychological effect at the surviving Jap soldiers become profound. Captured documents and put up struggle money owed found out the shock and disbelief of gaining knowledge of that a whole regiment were annihilated in an unmarried night time. The Americans had no longer fought consistent with Jap expectations, that they had no longer panicked beneath the cover of a nighttime attack. They'd not damaged while charged via screaming warriors. As an alternative, they'd remained steadfast of their prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to go into the meticulously deliberate killing zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The maximum devastating attention got here from analyzing the captured equipment and assessing the battlefield. The Americans possessed a stage of fabric wealth that Jap intelligence had absolutely didn't realize. The Browning gadget weapons never jammed, by no means overheated past their design potential, and never failed because of terrible protection or inadequate spare elements. Each Marine appeared to hold more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery help that the Marines could call upon some distance exceeded something the Japanese ought to deploy. And the seamless coordination among infantry artillery and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an incorporated device of destruction that Jap forces had in no way before encountered. Inside days of the Tenaru disaster, more Japanese forces were already on course to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a large naval operation to assist the next attempt to retake Henderson subject. 3 gradual shipping ships departed troop on August 16th, wearing the closing 1,400 infantrymen from Ikaki's regiment plus 500 naval marines. However, after the naval battle of the Jap Solomons led to heavy harm to one of the transports, Eastern Command determined to abandon the usage of sluggish transport ships absolutely. Instead, they could utilize destroyers for what have become called the Tokyo-specific runs. Among August 29th and September 4th, numerous destroyers and light cruisers introduced nearly 5,000 troops of Major Popular, Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Tivu Point. The Tokyo-specific labored brilliantly as a technique of moving men with destroyers capable of make the round ride from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in an unmarried night, minimizing their exposure to American air assaults. However, this approach had a critical weak point. Heavy device could not be transported in this way. Artillery portions, tanks, trucks, and most significantly, adequate meals and ammunition had to be left in the back of. This logistical reality might ultimately doom each Eastern offensive on Guadalcanal. Infantrymen arrived with simplest what they might deliver, pressured to rely on nearby foraging, and whatever supplies will be infiltrated via American strains. As the campaign wore on, Jap troops might find themselves scuffling with now not simplest against American firepower, however also towards starvation itself. Standard Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his attack on Henderson Field. His plan called for a 3-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coastal place. A second force might assault from the south, penetrating through the dense jungle to strike at what Japanese intelligence believed turned into the weakest point within the American defenses. Kawaguchi himself could lead the main effort from the south, approaching along an inland ridge that dominated Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi did no longer realize became that Marine intelligence had already diagnosed this ridge as the most possibly street of technique. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commanding officer of the primary raider battalion, carried out a raid on Tasamoko village on September 8th and determined large deliver dumps, indicating that a huge Jap force was concentrating within the region. Edson immediately surmised the Japanese plan they could come from the south, the use of the ridge as their method course. Edson requested permission to set up a protective line on the ridge itself, a request that preferred Vandergrift's speedy authorized. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned about 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the equal meticulous care that had characterized the Tenaru defenses system weapons, located to create interlocking hearth mortar crews registered on possibly approach routes and artillery from the 11th Marines plotted shielding fireplace missions. Every advantage of terrain and firepower became cautiously calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a narrow coral backbone approximately 1,000 m long, which include 3 distinct hills blanketed with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both facets heavily wooded and in a few locations impenetrable. It became the best terrain for an evening attack through infiltrating infantry, but it became additionally, if properly defended, a killing ground. At the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their attack, Unlike Ikiki's frontal raid, this attack became extra sophisticated. Eastern infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, trying to envelop the American positions. Small devices probed for vulnerable factors, and when they observed them, large forces concentrated for step-forward tries. The fighting was savage and stressed. Within the darkness, Marines often located themselves engaged in hand-to-hand fight with Jap squaddies who had infiltrated to inside grenade range. However, the protecting preparations held. Whilst Japanese forces focused for leap-forward tries, Marine mortars and artillery shattered them. The 11th Marines fired extra than 2,000 rounds at some stage in the night time, losing excessive explosive shells so near the Marine positions that shrapnel wounded pleasant troops. System gun crews fired till their barrels glowed pink in the darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching equipment, something that came handy. Sergeant Fundamental Jacob Vuza, the equal scout who had warned of the Tenaru assault, moved via the strains, encouraging the Marines and pointing out eastern infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone manned a gadget gun function that have become important to the defense. While his gun crews had been killed or wounded, Basilone persevered firing by myself, repelling wave after wave of Jap attacks. He might later get hold of the Medal of Honor for his moves that night time. In total, 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at Edson's Ridge and 19 could acquire the military move. As sunrise broke on September 13th, the Japanese assault had failed to break through. However, Kawaguchi had greater troops to be had and prepared to renew the assault. The subsequent night time, Edson pulled his strains lower back to the middle of the ridge, consolidating his forces. Trendy Vandergrift dispatched reinforcements, bringing the total defending pressure to approximately 2,500 guys. The Japanese might attack once more, but this time the Marines were equipped with even more potent positions and extra concentrated firepower. The second one night's combating became even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his last forces into desperate attempts to break through before the Yank reinforcements made the position impregnable. Japanese squaddies charged again and again, dying by using the hundreds inside the gadget gunfire. Some assaults got here inside 50 yards of Edson's command put up before being stopped. At one factor, the state of affairs was so determined that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. However, again, American firepower and shielding education prevailed. By using dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had absolutely collapsed. Eastern casualties have been dazzling with approximately 830 to 850 squaddies dead on and round Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties totaled about 104 killed and over 200 wounded among the Raider and Parachute battalions. The Ridge, which might forever after be referred to as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, had turned out to be a grim monument to the effectiveness of Yank shielding doctrine. For the Japanese soldiers who survived the warfare, represented some other profound surprise to their understanding of conflict. Captured diaries and post-war bills continuously defined the same consciousness Japanese forces had predicted to combat other infantry in the darkness where their education and spirit might triumph. Rather, they encountered artillery, device weapons, and mortars, all concentrated with a precision they could not suit. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones. They waited for Eastern forces to go into, after which they systematically destroyed them with coordinated hearth aid. The battles at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge set up patterns that could repeat at some point of the Guadalcanal campaign. Jap forces might release assaults based on braveness night approaches and near-combat understanding. American forces would reply with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined palms operations, and defensive positions cautiously prepared to maximize their blessings. The outcome became tragically predictable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic, whilst American casualties would be extensive but sustainable. But numbers on my own cannot absolutely seize the sheer horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon killing with chilling impartiality. Malaria infected nearly each guy who spent various weeks at the island. By way of December 1942, the primary Marine Division might record over 8,000 malaria instances. Tropical illnesses disabled approximately 23 of the department. Dysentery changed into nearly universal. Guys suffered from fungal infections that ate via the skin. Jungle rot brought about open sores that in no way healed within the oppressive warmth. Dental issues and not using a remedy led to abscessed enamel and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even worse. Their deliver state of affairs supposed inadequate food from the very starting. Infantrymen had been presupposed to receive subject rations, but the Tokyo explicit should not often supply enough. Guys subsisted on something they could forage, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin. Starvation became a consistent accomplice. Scientific supplies had been nearly non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out speedy and changed into never adequately resupplied. Wounded infantrymen regularly died from infections that were without difficulty treatable with right medicinal drug. Eastern files captured later in the campaign painted a scary photo of situations. A medical officer's file from overdue October stated that extra than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by means of disease or malnutrition. Fight effectiveness had plummeted to perhaps 30% of authorized power. Squaddies were demised at a charge of 50 consistent with day, maximum from hunger and disease in preference to combat wounds. American supply ships blanketed with the aid of Henderson's subject plane at some point of sunlight hours regularly introduced food, ammunition, scientific elements, and replacement device. Shortages did arise, particularly in August and early September, while naval defeats left the Marines quickly reduce off. However, those had been handiest brief setbacks. By using October, the glide of substances had emerged as reliable. Marines ate canned rations that, even as now not specially appetizing, provided okay calories and vitamins. Ammunition became abundant sufficient that device gunners may want to fire till their barrels wore out and then truly request replacements. Evacuation of significant cases to rear area hospitals. In stark assessment, Japanese logistics consisted of something will be carried on destroyer decks or infiltrated via American traces. Squaddies found out to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition become conserved to the factor that orders often confined fire to best when virtually essential. Hospital treatment supposed a bandage in case you were lucky, amputation without anesthesia, in case you have been unfortunate, or dying in case your wound have become infected. Critically wounded infantrymen were often given grenades and left in the back of to commit suicide rather than burden their devices or chance capture. In late October, the Japanese installed their largest offensive of the marketing campaign. General Hyakutake himself got here to Guadalcanal to, for my part, command the operation, bringing with him elements of the 2nd 1 Division, which includes experienced troops from China. The plan referred to as for coordinated assaults from a couple of directions, with the primary attempt coming from the south, through the dense jungle much like the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, Japanese forces could have extra men, better coordination, and artillery assist that had in the end been brought through destroyers. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, an extraordinary sight on Guadalcanal because of the issue of transporting them, led an attack across the Mattanica River. American defenders, such as factors of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Yank Department, had been equipped. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in short succession. The attack fast collapsed with heavy casualties. The main attack got here at the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 600 Japanese troops below most important popular Yuminasu, attacked from the south, hoping to break through American strains south of Henderson discipline. They confronted the 1st Battalion 7th Marines underneath Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by using factors of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The combating that night time became legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese assaults got here in waves all through the night time. Character breakthroughs had been sealed off by way of instant counterattacks. Gadget gunners fired till their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles and continued combating. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired chance near missions that landed within yards of the Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USA, Washington stood with the aid of, ready to offer naval gunfire aid if referred to as a pawn. At one important moment, only an unmarried Marine battalion stood among Eastern forces in Henderson area, but they did now not spoil. Sergeant John Basilone, who had outstanding himself at Bloody Ridge again, have become vital to the defense. When ammunition ran low for his gadget gun phase, Basilone, in my opinion, carried ammunition through enemy fire to preserve his guns operational. He repaired broken system guns below fire. When one gun roll changed into overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that restored the line. By sunrise on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. Fashionable Nasu became dead killed by way of gadget gun fireplace throughout one of the nighttime attacks. More than 2,000 Jap squaddies had died in the attempt to break via. American casualties have been numerous hundred killed and wounded. Excessive but sustainable. October 1942 additionally saw main naval engagements that decisively shifted the stability of electricity around Guadalcanal. The naval warfare of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, noticed some of the maximum intense floor combat in naval records. In a harassed middle-of-the-night melee on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged an eastern bombardment pressure that included the battleships Hay and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only American flag officers killed in world struggle II floor engagements, died within the combating. The people misplaced mild cruisers and 4 destroyers. 3 more destroyers were broken. However, the Japanese misplaced the battleship High disabled within the night motion and sunk through aircraft day after today. Extra importantly, the bombardment undertaking failed. Henderson discipline remained operational. On the nights of November 14th and 15th, the Japanese battleship Kirishima made every other strive at bombardment handiest to be intercepted by way of the United States of America Washington and USA South Dakota. In a display of devastating accuracy thanks to American radar-directed gunnery, the Washington landed 9.16-inch shells on the Kirishima from a variety where Eastern lookouts may want to slightly even spot their goal. The Kirishima Troy sank, taking a heavy toll in lives with it. Possibly even extra important, American plane and surface ships decimated an Eastern convoy trying to enhance Guadalcanal with the 38th Department and its heavy equipment. Of the 11 transport ships, simplest 4 managed to reach Guadalcanal, and those have been right away destroyed via plane and artillery earlier than they may fully sell off their cargo. Japanese casualties from this disastrous convoy passed 5,000 men. This marked the final severe try to bolster the forces on Guadalcanal with a massive, well-prepared floor contingent. For the Japanese troops already on the island, November signaled the beginning of the end. They have been anticipating reinforcements and desperately wished resupplies. Instead, the awful reality dawned on them. The naval battles had been lost. The convoys obliterated, and no in addition assistance become approaching. Rations had been slashed over again, forcing already ravenous men to survive on even much less. Clinical resources, which have been critically low to start with, vanished altogether. Makeshift discipline hospitals overflowed with the sick and wounded, where medical doctors may want to simplest stand via and watch guys succumb to their fate. Captured Japanese diaries from this era offered a stark and heartbreaking glimpse into their sluggish collapse. Entries observed rice rations dwindling to an unmarried ball per day. Disorder unfold unchecked. Our bodies have been burned simplest while infantrymen still possess the strength to do so. The frightening recognition that no more substances were coming set in. Men resorted to ingesting grass and bark, and some even died from consuming poisonous vegetation. The once proud squatties deteriorated into determined, starving shadows in their former selves. December delivered the final reckoning. Eastern Command at Rabble made the agonizing choice to evacuate Guadalcanal. They couldn't publicly surrender. However, in non-public they identified that continuing the operation could result in the whole destruction of the 17th Navy. About 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, a stark assessment to their height electricity of 36,000. Of these 11,000, possibly most effective 7,000 were still fit sufficient to walk. The relaxation have been ravaged via illness wounds, or so weakened through starvation that they could barely move slowly. The evacuation named Operation K might turn out to be one of the most a success Japanese operations of the entire struggle, using destroyer runs much like the Tokyo Express. Eastern naval forces controlled to extract 1,052 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It became an amazing fulfillment given the difficult circumstances, but it couldn't mask the size of the defeat. Jap forces on Guadalcanal had reached a peak of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of those, more or less 25,000 to 30,000 perished with an predicted 14,800 killed in fight, and some other 10,000 to 15,000 succumbing to disorder and hunger. American casualties were also widespread, however, in the end sustainable. The Marines and military devices that fought on Guadalcanal lost about 600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand greater quickly sidelined by tropical sicknesses. But American enterprise and manpower should conveniently replace these losses. New divisions have been already in schooling. Ships and planes were being churned out at a rate that outpaced their losses. The strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military questioning can't be overstated. For the primary time, Japanese forces were decisively defeated in sustained floor combat. Each offensive had faltered. Every try to observe conventional Eastern tactical doctrine had ended in catastrophic casualties. The stunning revelation that American forces had been no longer simplest materially superior, however additionally tactically equipped, properly led, and able to enduring terrible conditions shattered pre-struggle assumptions. Japanese officials who survived Guadalcanal and later penned memoirs or were interviewed after the battle always emphasized several key themes. First, they had fundamentally underestimated the fighting abilities of the people. Second, the disparity in device and substances changed into some distance greater than pre-war intelligence had advised. 0.33. Eastern logistics had been woefully insufficient for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled each the ocean and the air. Fourth, non-secular strength and tactical ability proved inadequate towards overwhelming negative aspects in firepower and resources. Post-war money owed from Japanese veterans discovered a steady and sobering assessment. They had believed themselves to be advanced warriors driven by means of an unshakable spirit. They educated more difficult, embraced demise more effectively, and mastered nighttime fighting and close fight. However, on Guadalcanal, they learned the brutal reality struggle is decided by using systems. The people had systems for the entirety, structures for deliver for medical care, for artillery help, and for air coordination, and each machine functioned effectively. Eastern systems, then again, failed because they had been by no means adequately advanced in the first region. Japanese veterans who survived the marketing campaign and had been later interviewed supplied particular accounts that directly contradicted official Eastern explanations for the defeat. They mentioned that American forces fought superbly at night time while defending prepared positions. They admitted that people persevered malaria, dysentery, and appalling conditions, whilst keeping combat effectiveness because of advanced logistical help. They diagnosed that American firepower turned into overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely introduced. An unmarried American battalion possessed more effective firepower than a whole Jap regiment. The technical factors of American superiority were tremendous. Eastern forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons that required guide biking between each shot. American Marines to start with carried M1903 Springfield rifles, additionally bolt-action, but these have been increasingly supplemented by using the M1 Garand semi-automated rifle as they became available. The Garand's 8 spherical capability and semi-computerized operation supplied an essential gain in firefights. Gadget weapons informed a far more lopsided tale. The American Manton 217A1 Browning was water-cooled and will preserve fire indefinitely. Supplied water and ammunition have been available. Jap gadget weapons, mainly the Type 96 and Kind 99, have been lighter and more transportable, but lack sustained hearth functionality. In defensive positions, this distinction proved decisive. Artillery superiority became perhaps the most substantial issue. The 11th Marines operated M1A1% howitzers that would be damaged down and transported through the dense jungle terrain. Those 75 guns provided responsive and accurate fire guide. Forward observers embedded with infantry devices ought to name in fireplace missions and acquire supporting rounds inside mins. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal become constrained, hard to transport through the jungle, and chronically quick of ammunition. Naval gunfire added every other size that Eastern forces actually could not healthy. Destroyers and cruisers offshore ought to deliver devastating bombardments on Japanese positions or provide responsive fireplace assist for marine floor gadgets. Radio communique between shore primarily based observers and naval ships allowed for remarkably unique targeting. Air strength have become increasingly dominant as the marketing campaign wore on. The Cactus Air Force, running from Henderson area beneath exceedingly difficult conditions, steadily mounted air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39, Aracabras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Eastern bomber raids. SPD Dauntless dive bombers relentlessly struck Eastern positions, deliver ships and troop concentrations. Jap air forces flying from Rabble needed to operate at the extreme limits in their range, giving them minimal time over the target. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated just how absolutely the balance of electricity had shifted. Main General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now comprised of both Marine and Army divisions, released coordinated assaults that systematically decreased the ultimate Japanese positions. The offensive enjoyed overwhelming help from artillery air power and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, at the same time as determined, was significantly hampered by using hunger sickness and crucial ammunition shortages. On February 9, 1943, American patrols observed that Japanese forces had evacuated the island. Fashionable Patch famously sent his message to Admiral Halley, Tokyo Express now not has terminus on Guadalcanal. The marketing campaign becomes sooner or later over. 6 months of brutal preventing had resulted in the first principal American ground victory against Japan. Extra importantly, it set up styles and found out truths that might shape the direction of the rest of the Pacific battle. The training Japanese survivors took from Guadalcanal had been devastating to pre-war Army doctrine. The parable of Jap warrior superiority lay in ruins. Character courage and tactical ability had been virtually inadequate in opposition to systematic dangers. Night assaults and near fight, the hallmarks of Japanese tactical fulfillment in China, failed miserably in opposition to American defensive positions. Supply and logistics have been not secondary concerns, however essential requirements for sustained fight. Air and naval superiority determined results on land. Those instructions found out in blood and hunger on Guadalcanal ought to have essentially reformed Eastern military questioning. A few officers diagnosed the profound implications. Colonel Masanabu Tsuji, a workforce officer who visited Guadalcanal in the course of the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan had to absolutely reassess its complete approach. The individuals, he observed, were fighting an industrial war wherein cloth manufacturing decided the final results. Japan could not win in commercial struggle towards America's great efficient potential. However, Jap military culture, deeply rooted in generations of tradition and recent victories, couldn't without problems be given such essential revision. The professional cause of the Guadalcanal debacle blamed inadequate materials, naval defeats, and the surprising energy of American defenses. It with ease avoided acknowledging that Eastern tactical doctrine itself was unsuitable, and that the complete thought of battle that had served Japan so well towards China become now out of date towards a cutting-edge industrialized opponent. The ones Jap infantrymen who survived Guadalcanal and have been later captured, or who lived through the conflict have become witnesses to a transformation they in no way ought to have imagined. They had entered the marketing campaign as assured warriors of an invincible empire imbued with an indomitable spirit. They emerged as ravenous, sickness-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat, their bodies and minds shattered by using the enjoy. Many later defined Guadalcanal as the instant they first understood that Japan might unavoidably lose the warfare. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this profound mental transformation. They stated studying truths that their leaders had intentionally concealed. The Americans have been no longer weak, however overwhelmingly robust, now not simply in weapons, but additionally in business enterprise logistics, leadership, and their unwavering ability to sustain combat operations. Jap forces fought with simple courage and ability. However, in the end, it did no longer matter. American forces fought with systems and sources that the Japanese in reality could not match. The American angle on Guadalcanal emphasized specific, however similarly critical training. For the Marines and squaddies who fought there, the marketing campaign proved that American forces should stand toe-to-toe with Japanese troops inside the brutal situations of jungle fight. The long-held mythology of Japanese invincibility became irrevocably shattered. American shielding doctrine labored. Combined hands coordination changed into powerful. Man or woman American soldiers well trained and geared up were extra than able to defeating Eastern forces. However, Americans additionally received a newfound recognize for Japanese infantrymen as tough, decided and professional adversaries who would fight to the dying rather than give up. The willingness of Eastern forces to hold attacking within the face of hopeless odds, to bear hunger in preference to surrender, and to die instead of retreat, made a profound impression on their American opposite numbers. The stark assessment among the two aspects approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender highlighted fundamental cultural differences. American forces made actual efforts to inspire Jap give up, dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, and presenting hospital treatment and food to prisoners. Those efforts, but, met with minimum achievement. Of the approximately 36,000 Eastern troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 had been captured alive, and most of those had been too ill or wounded to withstand siege. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal prolonged some distance past the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation surely validated that the Japanese protecting perimeter will be penetrated. Allied methods shifted decisively from shielding operations to offensive campaigns. The colossal industrial and fabric blessings that America possessed can be translated into military victory if carried out systematically and relentlessly. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the start of the cease. The loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships couldn't get replaced at anything drawing near the price at which the USA began producing new forces. The decision to evacuate, but quietly made, became an admission that Japan could not preserve a war of attrition against American industrial may. The veterans of Guadalcanal on each side carried their stories with them for the relaxation of their lives. American Marines and squaddies who survived the marketing campaign became helpful cadres for brand spanking new gadgets, passing alongside difficult turn lessons approximately jungle war, protective procedures, and blended fingers coordination. The primary Marine Department pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of relaxation and rehabilitation before it can return to combat. Eastern survivors confronted a grimmer future. Those evacuated for the duration of Operation Kai were dispersed to different devices in the course of the Pacific, sporting with them no longer handiest the psychological burden of defeat, but additionally, the plain expertise that American forces have been some distance greater ambitious than pre-warfare propaganda had ever recommended. Many could perish in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic function persisted to become worse. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months of intense fight for decades in a while. Wrecked plane destroyed motors, deserted equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastal areas. Henderson discipline accelerated and improved all through and after the marketing campaign served as a primary Allied base for next operations inside the Solomon Islands. For Army historians and strategists, Guadalcanal supplied a wealth of case studies in amphibious operations, jungle battle, logistics, air-floor coordination, and the seamless integration of naval energy with land operations. The marketing campaign underscored the critical lesson that present-day warfare required a long way greater than simply courageous squaddies and tactical skill. It demanded substantial commercial ability, effective logistics, technological superiority, and the unwavering potential to maintain operations over prolonged periods. The human cost of Guadalcanal changed into marvelous on each aspect. Greater than 7,000 American and Eastern servicemen died within the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties surpassed 7,000 killed, wounded, or lacking. Japanese losses have been even greater, devastating, exceeding 30,000 from all causes. Thousands extra on both facets suffered from diseases and situations that would have an effect on their fitness for the rest in their lives. But the strategic importance of the marketing campaign in basically Army terms justified the terrible value. Guadalcanal represented the turning point in which Allied forces shifted decisively from protection to offense inside the Pacific. It validated unequivocally that Japan may be defeated in ground combat. It installed the air and naval superiority patterns that could represent the relaxation of the conflict. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle war on Guadalcanal is at its middle a tale about the collision between two basically distinct methods to modern warfare. One side fervently believed inside the supremacy of the warrior spirit in braveness overcoming cloth hazards, and in processes generating victory irrespective of available resources. The opposite side positioned its religion inside the systematic utility of commercial strength in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, and in blended hands coordination as the important thing to last success. The jungles of Guadalcanal became the crucible in which those conflicting philosophies clashed. The outcome, although it took 6 months of brutal fighting to reach its inevitable end, unequivocally confirmed that focused hearth support and meticulously deliberate logistics, when blended with able tactics and decided squaddies, created a shape of military power that Japanese forces surely couldn't shape. For the Japanese squaddies who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their memories, the marketing campaign represented the instant when stark fact brutally destroyed comforting illusions. They learned that their schooling were based totally on false assumptions. Their strategies had been designed for a special form of struggle. Their logistics were woefully inadequate from the very starting, and their nation became engaged in a warfare that it couldn't possibly win through Navy way by myself. The people who fought on Guadalcanal discovered exceptional but equally critical training. They discovered that they could certainly fit Japanese soldiers inside the brutal depth of combat. They proved that American business strength might be translated into decisive Navy victory. They advanced effective techniques and sound doctrine for jungle conflict that might serve them fantastically properly in next campaigns, and that they shattered the pervasive fantasy of Eastern invincibility, changing it with a sensible assessment of a difficult, determined, however ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal changed into the place in which Jap troops were terrified, now not a lot by means of American squaddies as character fighters ambitious, even though they proved to be, but via the systematic, overwhelming and constant application of firepower and fabric resources that American forces brought to each unmarried engagement. It turned into a terror born no longer from a fear of dying, which Eastern soldiers have been meticulously trained to simply accept. However, from the frightening realization that braveness and sacrifice were in the long run meaningless against an enemy whose materials by no means ran out, whose wounded obtained set off in powerful care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose plane controlled the skies with impunity, and whose industrial base could results easily update losses faster than fight ought to inflict them. The transformation that commenced, while Eastern forces first encountered American jungle conflict on Guadalcanal, marked a fundamental shift inside the Pacific struggle. From that pivotal factor forward, Eastern forces would be in large part at the shielding, preventing a dropping warfare towards an enemy whose material blessings grew large and more decisive with each passing month. The jungle conflict of Guadalcanal became the grim template for future campaigns, proving that American forces should fight and win in even the most tough terrain against a decided enemy, supplied that they had get admission to adequate logistics, powerful coordination, and overwhelming firepower.